Let's go now and continue our focus on world affairs. Joining me now is foreign editor at the Australian newspaper, Greg Sheridan. Thanks very much for your time today, Greg. Why don't we start on this trade deal? Pretty interesting developments with RCEP over the weekend and a lot of similarities with the TPP. A big country pulls out, but Australia really pushing for the deal still to get done.
Well, Tom, look, it's great to be with you, but I got to say, RCEP on the whole amounts to 2/3 of more or less nothing. I think what it shows you is that these multilateral trade agreements are not the way of the future. They can't really achieve anything. I mean, there's no additional market access for Australia in anything in RCEP. We've got free trade agreements with all the countries involved. The Trans-Pacific Partnership has much better services and intellectual property guarantees and so on, and Japan, Vietnam, Singapore and Malaysia are members of that with us. And even what RCEP allegedly provides for, progress in the services agreement, the ASEAN nations have sort of declared they're going to do it in principle. Well, I've been covering ASEAN for 40 years and I think there are still things they declared they were going to do in principle 40 years ago that I'm still covering, that I'm still waiting for. But look, it's a good thing, it moves the train in the right direction, maybe by 1 centimetre, but there's not much in it really, and all the big action on trade now I think comes in bilateral trade agreements like that which is going on between the US and China.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a sec. So just briefly on this, is the whole point, well, there's no point in Australia rocking the boat on this. We send out a message about free trade and that's about all from our point of view. Is there an element of a sop to China at all?
Well, yes and no. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership was designed by the Americans to protect their interests in intellectual property and the burgeoning growth of trade in services, and then the Americans pulled out. And that was not just Trump. Hillary Clinton claimed she wasn't going to sign the TPP either. Multilateral trade agreements have become very unpopular, very difficult to sell. Now, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, it's a wonderful acronym soup here, Tom, for anyone who gets involved in this stuff, was a Chinese initiative to show that they could do something without the Americans. But back when we were saying how great the Americans were and how weak the Chinese were, we would always contrast the sort of hollow, vapid, empty nature of RCEP compared to the robust, strong, vibrant nature of TPP. Well, now, you're happy to celebrate any party you're invited to. Look, there are tiny things in it. Allegedly, it's going to be easier for businessmen to get visas or something, although I've heard that story too, at least twice a year, every year for 40 years. I think there's very little in it. But, if you're invited to a regional party and it's allegedly going to produce some marginal increase in the access for our services exporters, that's a good thing. I mean, the problems in our economy have nothing to do with trade access anywhere. But on the whole, nobody really paid much attention to it. There's no mention of it in The Economist this week. There's nothing on it in the Real Clear Politics site in American politics. I mean, nobody really thinks it amounts to anything, but, go along with it, and China...
tick and flick, maybe.
Yeah, tick and flick, absolutely.
Yeah, you mentioned the alphabet soup. I remember when they tried to change the TPP and threw all these other letters in there, we said, no, not interested. We've already got a name for it. We'll keep that one. Thanks very much. Greg, you mentioned the other big trade deal making headlines, the potential one, or the truce, whatever you want to call it, the US and China. What are you expecting now?
Well, look, I think plainly there's going to be some kind of a deal there, but I think Trump is starting to run into a problem where he's running out of credibility because he keeps doing things and then reversing them, keeps threatening to do them and then not doing them, keeps imposing tariffs, then taking them off. I think the Chinese have sort of slightly lost interest in all this, but the Chinese and American economies are both going into a bit of a slowdown at the moment, so we are going to get some kind of deal which will at the very least mean no new tariffs. It may mean some tariffs coming off, and it probably means the Chinese agreeing to buy a certain amount of American goods. Because with all of this trade war, the American trade deficit with China has actually increased under Trump, not decreased. It's not going to go to the big structural issues between the two economies. Not going to do anything about intellectual property theft. It's not going to do anything about the need to decouple high-tech supply lines, supply chains, production chains in areas like artificial intelligence and telcos and so on. But we're going to get at least a temporary truce. All the big problems will be kicked into the long grass, but it's in the interests of both Xi and Trump to get a temporary truce. It'll be a little bit like RCEP in that the rhetoric will be bigger than the substance.
Well, so this is the thing, right? Because Donald Trump, unlike President Xi, he's got this election approaching. This is core to his election, and plenty of things that a lot of people that aren't Trump fans were cheering him on about. For example, what's happening with intellectual property. But you think from here, he just needs to have an agreement and go for rhetoric over reality in the next presidential election?
I think that's right. But having said that, I don't think Trump is going to surrender on the big structural issues. I just think they're going to put them to one side. I mean, the whole US national security establishment wants to disentangle from China in quantum computing, AI, and a few other high-tech areas. And then also they have a big problem about intellectual property theft, which the Chinese have refused to address in any meaningful way. But at the same time, he doesn't want, you know, the corn farmers of the Midwest not to be able to sell their product to the Chinese. He's a bit unhappy about American consumer products still coming from China, but now coming at a higher price than they were before he put the tariffs on. Everything with Trump now, and this is common with any president at this point in the cycle, it's all about the re-election bid. So if he can get something that he can market as a win, get increased sales for farmers in the Midwest, I think that's going to be enough. He'll declare it a great victory, but the deep structural problems between the US and China will remain with us.
I guess, and I guess the problem for people hoping that China might actually change the way it approaches trade if this approach doesn't work. Well, look, maybe others will, but they weren't scared off. We're nearly out of time, Greg. I just want to ask you finally about Australia-China relations in this sort of, well, I suppose they've thawed out a bit over the weekend. What was your take?
Well, that's right. So it's an interesting commentary on the East Asia Summit and RCEP and so on that neither the Chinese nor the President nor the Americans sent their president. Neither Xi Jinping nor Donald Trump went there. But the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang went there. So Scott Morrison went from seeing the Vice President a week or two ago, and now he's seen the Premier. And it was a good, constructive meeting. And in all the recent kerfuffles between Australia and China, there has been no real disturbance to our trade. Nothing has happened to iron ore. Nothing has happened in substance to coal. So the relationship...
Yeah, bar a few little delays, right? Nothing major.
Yeah, very minor delays. And you can't even be absolutely certain that they emerged out of our political difficulties. They may have emerged out of regional efforts to be more self-sufficient in coal within China and so forth. But I think the relationship is probably less disturbed than we thought, but it was never really very chummy. It's a very pragmatic, transactional relationship. Anyone who gets misty-eyed about the Chinese Communist Party really needs to go and see their psychiatrist. You know, that's not the kind of relationship we have. It's a pragmatic business relationship. It's on an even keel, more or less. And the fact that the Chinese Premier was willing to see Scott Morrison and utter a few, you know, diplomatic cliches, that's a good sign. So you're not going to go to heaven with the Chinese or anything, but it's business as usual, and business as usual is about as good as it gets.
And business between the two countries is pretty good. Greg Sheridan, always appreciate your time. Thank you.